Imagine you're standing on the deck of a 17th century warship in the cold waters of the North Sea. Around you, hundreds of sailors stand in absolute silence. Their eyes are fixed on a man, stripped naked, hands and feet bound, a heavy iron weight shackled to his ankles. Officers thread a thick rope beneath the ship's hull. The condemned man is tied to it. The captain raises his hand, the drum rolls, and then, without mercy, the man is thrown overboard. But this isn't drowning, this is keelhauling, a punishment so savage that it became the most feared sentence a sailor could receive. Today, we're diving into the dark history of this maritime torture, exploring its origins, its victims, and the cold logic of power that kept it alive for over 1,000 years. The earliest definitive record of keelhauling comes from the Byzantine Rhodian Maritime Code around 700 CE, which explicitly outlined it as punishment for piracy. But the practice may be far older. Images on Greek vases from 500 BCE depict similar punishments, and Herodotus makes ambiguous references in his histories. By the medieval period, keelhauling had evolved from ancient custom into codified naval law. The sea was humanity's lawless frontier. Ships operated as floating kingdoms, isolated for months. Out there, the captain's word was absolute, and absolute power, unchecked, breeds cruelty. The Dutch were the first to formally legalise it. In 1560, the Dutch Navy issued an ordinance explicitly authorising keelhauling for serious offences. This wasn't a captain's whim. This was state-sanctioned torture, written into military law. The word Keelhaulen, meaning to drag along the keel, entered maritime vocabulary across Europe. For nearly 3 centuries, until 1853, the Dutch Navy officially employed this punishment. The English Royal Navy also practiced it, though less systematically. 17th century naval writers William Monson and Nathaniel Boteler recorded instances on English ships, though their accounts remain frustratingly vague. Why such extreme brutality? Sailors lived in conditions we can barely imagine. Cramped quarters, rotten food, months without land, constant threat of death. Mutiny was ever present. Desertion was common. Traditional discipline proved insufficient. Fear became the cornerstone of naval order, and keelhauling was fear made flesh. Understanding how keelhauling was carried out reveals its calculated cruelty. This wasn't spontaneous violence, it was a meticulously orchestrated ritual. The condemned sailor would be stripped naked, hands and feet bound. Heavy weights, iron chains or cannonballs would be shackled to his ankles, pulling him downward to scrape along the ship's hull. Sailors would thread a thick rope completely underneath the keel, securing it to the yardarms on both sides. The victim would be tied to this rope at its midpoint. There were 2 variations. The first involved dragging the victim across the width of the ship, roughly 14 feet on a typical vessel. This lesser punishment gave a slim chance of survival. The second dragged him along the entire length, bow to stern, 39 feet or more on modest ships, over 100 on warships. This was essentially a death sentence, but drowning wasn't the only danger. After months at sea, ship hulls became encrusted with barnacles, small crustaceans with razor-sharp shells. As the victim was dragged across, his skin would be shredded. The salt water would burn every wound. If he survived drowning, blood loss might still kill him. Speed determined severity. Pulled slowly, the victim might sink deeper and miss the worst barnacles. Pulled quickly, as was common, he remained in constant contact with the hull, maximising mutilation. Sometimes Dutch officers forced an oil-soaked sponge into the victim's mouth, allowing 1 or 2 breaths underwater. This wasn't mercy. It prolonged life just enough to increase suffering. When finally hauled to the surface, the victim would be left hanging from the yardarm, displayed like a warning. If the captain deemed his injuries insufficient, the entire process would be repeated. The author Christophorus Friccius documented exactly such repeated keelhaulings in his 1680 book on voyages to the East Indies. The entire spectacle was deliberately public. The ship's crew would be assembled to watch. Large crowds would gather, hundreds of sailors forced to witness in silence. This wasn't incidental. It was the point. Keelhauling punished one man to terrorise hundreds. On October 11th, 1652, a sailor named Jan Blank was keelhauled under the command of Jan van Riebeek. His crime? Deserting his post with the Dutch East India Company for 9 days. Van Riebeek ordered the full punishment: keelhauling, 150 lashes, then 2 years of enslavement. Blank survived, barely. Van Riebeek's daily journals recorded this in detail, demonstrating that while often fatal, keelhauling could be survived, leaving victims scarred and broken. 21 years later, Dutch Admiral Cornelis Evertsen the youngest, nicknamed Little Cornelis the Devil, ordered what sources describe as the most graphic incident on record. When sailors under his command committed murder, Evertsen had them keel-hauled. Multiple victims, multiple times. Witnesses described the water turning red. The bodies were barely recognisable. No one in his fleet mutinied again. Perhaps the most famous case involves the ship's surgeon of Admiral Jan van Ness, keel-hauled sometime between 1660 and 1686. Dutch artist Lieve Verschaer immortalised this in a painting now housed in Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum. It depicts hundreds of spectators watching the punishment unfold on the River Maas. The surgeon hangs from the foremast being hoisted overboard. The painting captures the terror associated with keel-hauling, though historians note the tradition surrounding it remains unproven and improbable. Keel-hauling persisted into the 19th century. On September 9, 1882, 2 Egyptian sailors were court-martialed after attempted murder near Alexandria. Both survived, but witnesses were horrified. The London Morning Advertiser tried covering it but couldn't finish. Yesterday I tried to write a description. It was so revoltingly cruel, so barbarous, so infamously brutal that I gave it up. Curiously, 1 year earlier, British Parliament faced allegations that a marine aboard HMS Alexandra had been keel-hauled. George Shaw Lefevre, Secretary to the Admiralty, categorically denied it. It is wholly impossible. We have heard nothing about it. His denial raises questions. Was he covering up an illegal punishment? Or were the reports false? We'll never know. What we do know is that by 1880, keel-hauling had become so infamous that even allegations triggered international incidents. A ship at sea was a totalitarian state in miniature. The captain held absolute power over life and death. No appeal, no higher authority, no escape. This power existed for practical reasons. Ships required instant obedience. In a storm, hesitation could sink the vessel. In battle, failure to follow orders could kill everyone. Sailors were viewed not as free workers but as property. Keel-hauling served multiple functions. Obviously, it punished serious crimes: mutiny, murder, desertion, theft. These weren't petty offences, they were existential threats. From the captain's perspective, extreme punishment wasn't cruelty, it was survival. But keel-hauling's true power lay in deterrence. The punishment was always public, always theatrical, always traumatic. Every sailor saw the victim stripped and bound. They heard his screams. They watched the rope go taut. They saw what emerged: a body shredded, bleeding, barely alive, or dead. This image haunted them forever. It echoed in their minds every time they considered disobedience. That was the point. Keel-hauling was social control through trauma. It created a culture of fear. Sailors lived knowing any serious transgression could result in this fate. This fear didn't just prevent crime, it crushed dissent and resistance. It ensured that even thousands of miles from authority, sailors would police themselves. The practice also reinforced hierarchy. Only captains could order keel-haulings. Only officers supervised them. Common sailors became passive spectators, or worse, active participants, forced to man the ropes. This complicity was itself control. By making ordinary sailors participate, authorities ensured they became invested in the system. Interestingly, sources suggest keel-hauling wasn't always intended to be fatal. The 1780 British Maritime Dictionary notes that the culprit is allowed sufficient intervals to recover the sense of pain. A living victim, scarred and broken, served as a more effective deterrent than a corpse. He walked the decks as a reminder, a living warning. Virtually every seafaring culture developed its own vocabulary of maritime punishment. The French Navy employed la cale, dunking the victim into the sea repeatedly with a 30-pound cannonball tied to his feet. 3 dunks were standard. Unlike keel-hauling, which dragged horizontally, la cale plunged vertically. French authorities considered keel-hauling itself too barbaric. The British more commonly relied on flogging. The cat-o'-nine-tails could deliver hundreds of lashes, shredding a man's back. For serious offences, they practised flogging around the fleet. The condemned would be rowed to every ship in harbour, receiving lashes from each. Totals could reach hundreds. Many died from shock or blood loss. Hanging from the yardarm was universal. A noose around the neck, rope thrown over the yardarm, fellow sailors slowly hoisting him up until he strangled. This was considered the most dignified execution at sea. Pirates, despite their reputation, appear to have used keel hauling less frequently than navies. Most pirate punishments were quick: a bullet, being cast adrift, or marooning. Keel hauling required elaborate rigging and wasted time. What's striking is the pattern. Maritime punishment was always spectacle. Whether Dutch, English, French, or pirate, the goal was never simply to harm one person but to terrorise many. Violence, when organised and ritualised, becomes governance. For survivors, life after keel hauling was unbearable. Massive scars covered their bodies, permanent records marking them for life. The psychological trauma must have been immense, though no records document how victims coped. For crews, keel hauling created collective trauma. Every witnessing sailor carried that memory. This certainly created obedience, but it may also have created bitterness and rage. Some historians argue extreme harshness actually increased mutinies, that brutalised men, having nothing left to lose, became more likely to rebel. The practice generated international controversy. By the 18th century, as Enlightenment ideals spread, keel hauling became a source of shame. British sources from 1780 explicitly called it a Dutch Navy punishment, distancing themselves despite flogging their own sailors. Naval reformers criticised extreme punishments. Better discipline, they argued, came from fair treatment and adequate pay, not terror. These arguments gained traction slowly. The Dutch abolished keel hauling in 1853. The British ended most corporal punishment by the late 19th century. Yet its legacy persisted in language. Keel haul entered English meaning to reprimand harshly. The term survives today, stripped of its original horror. Few people realise they're invoking a torture method. The practice also left marks on naval culture. The absolute authority of captains, rigid hierarchy, culture of obedience, all forged partly through fear of punishments like keel hauling. Even today, maritime law grants ship captains extraordinary powers. The ghost of keel hauling haunts every ship's articles. In popular culture, keel hauling has become romanticised, part of swashbuckling pirate mythology. This obscures reality. Keel hauling was systematic, state-sanctioned torture by organised navies representing European empires, operating under official codes. Among historians, evidence remains frustratingly scarce. Records exist: ship's logs, legal codes, eyewitness accounts, but comprehensive documentation is lacking. Oxford naval historian Nicholas Roger noted he knows no authentic evidence for British use. We know it happened. We don't know how often. The victims remain largely nameless. This absence itself tells us something. Naval authorities didn't want to document their brutality carefully. Keel hauling existed in a grey zone. Legal but shameful, necessary but embarrassing. California State University Maritime Academy adopted the keel hauler as their mascot in 1974. This casual appropriation of torture as team spirit reveals how thoroughly we've domesticated historical violence. Museums offer soberer assessment. Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum displays Verschuur's painting with blunt description. A severe punishment whereby the condemned man was dragged beneath the ship's keel on a rope. It served as a terrible warning to all mariners. No romanticisation, just institutionalised cruelty. What's clear is that keel hauling wasn't an aberration. It was policy. It was law. For centuries, it was considered normal, necessary, and just. This should disturb us. It should make us question what practices of our own era will horrify future generations. Keel hauling reveals a truth echoing across centuries. Brutality is rarely random. It's organised. It's systematic. It serves purposes. The men who designed keel hauling, who wrote it into ordinances, who rigged the ropes, who ordered it, weren't monsters. They were administrators, officers, representatives of empires. They believed they were maintaining order. They would have said they had no choice. Without severe punishment, chaos would reign. But keel hauling teaches us something else, that human beings can inflict unimaginable suffering while telling themselves it's necessary. That we can institutionalize torture, make it routine, make it boring, that we can force good people to participate in evil and call it duty, the rope that dragged Jan Blanc under his ship in 1652. The barnacles that tore open flesh in 1673, the waters that turned red near Alexandria in 1882. These weren't accidents, they were choices, deliberate, calculated, justified. We like to think we've progressed, and in some ways, we have. No modern navy practices keelhauling, but the impulse behind it, using pain as control, terrorizing in service of order, sacrificing individuals for institutional stability, that impulse hasn't disappeared. It's merely found new forms, so we remember keelhauling not as curiosity but as warning. A warning about unchecked power, a warning about how quickly necessity becomes cruelty, a warning that the distance between civilization and barbarism is shorter than we believe. Let us not forget the men dragged beneath those ships. Let us not forget what was done to them, and why, and by whom. Their suffering demands our memory and our vigilance, because the rope is always ready. The barnacles still wait, and somewhere, someone is always deciding that cruelty is necessary. That's where history calls us to draw the line, not at the edge of the ship, but at the edge of our conscience,